Hey everyone, my name is Varnsika here with another video. Today we're going to be going through a pretty iconic problem. Actually, a better word is probably controversial because everyone either hates these guys or absolutely loves them. But the problem we're doing today is Vloxes, so NACLO 2023C. So yes, we are going to be looking at these guys. I personally am in the camp of people who like them. If you disagree, then literally no one asked. Sorry, what I meant to sorry, I get a little carried away sometimes. What I meant to say was you can shoot me an email. No reply at github.com. Oh yeah, you can shoot me an email right there, and I'll be sure to get back to you as soon as possible. So let's just jump right into it, and as usual, let's just start by reading through the problem. Exciting news, you've gotten clearance to touch grass. Your job there is to take care of some Martian animals called Vloxes. Here are the 9 Vloxes that you are in charge of. Your manager asks you to identify which Vloxes fit the following descriptions. Yap, yap, yap. Unfortunately, many of these words are unfamiliar to you, and you don't have a dictionary. Luckily, you do have an encyclopedia article on the next page that uses these words. Even though the article doesn't define the words directly, you can figure out a lot about a word based on how it is used and context. In fact, this basic strategy is an important approach in computational linguistics. When computers need to learn the meanings of words, they do so by analyzing the context that those words appear in. Study the encyclopedia article on the net yap 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 whatever. So we're gonna, instead of studying the encyclopedia article like we asked us to, we're gonna first look at the Vloxes and just identify what traits they have that we can use to distinguish the Vloxes. So the first thing that we might notice is that they have these kind of horns on their head. So there are 2 that have horns and 2 that don't. So horn, yes or no. And the reason why let me make this like real big. Is that big enough? Yeah, I don't think that's big enough. Yeah, that seems pretty good. So horn, yes or no. I wrote yes or no because it's kind of a one or the other thing. You can't have like half a horn. Well, maybe you can, but that doesn't seem particularly healthy. At least in this problem, there are no 3.14159 horns that Vloxes can have. So we'll keep that in mind that you either have a horn or you don't. Another important quality that we might notice is size. I'll get this to work, I swear. Size, so we have this one kind of really big blocks in the bottom right corner, and then most of them are like kind of the same kind of average size, and then we have 2 B and F that are like pretty small. So we'll write big, medium, small. That is not supposed to happen. That is still not supposed to happen. Okay. Guys, I know how to use technology, I swear, I promise. I am the most adept technology user of all time. So the other thing we'll notice is that when we stare upon the absolute beauty that is their irregular pentagon of a body, we will notice that there is this kind of stripe, and that stripe varies in its placement. So we have these kind of, it's a pentagon, therefore it has 5 points, shockingly. So it has like 5 general places, kind of cardinal direction type things where it can be placed, and then we see in some cases it's kind of in between 2 points, kind of leaning in one direction or the other. So we'll write that as stripe placement. And then for the last thing, we'll write this kind of weird thing going on with the feet. I like to call that socks. So like how long the socks are, which like honestly, I guess you kind of need socks on Mars. Like, I don't know how that works personally. Never been to Mars. Kind of an L on my part. That's my bad, y'all. So now that we have these 4 things in mind, and of course, let's kind of keep in mind generally how these descriptors are working. So for the horns, we're going to have like a kind of binary thing. Either is a horn on a Vlox or there isn't. And then for size, we have kind of 3 quantities, 2 that are like more kind of extreme. Stripe placement, we have a more kind of variable thing with 5 main values, but also the possibility for things kind of in between. And then for the socks, it's kind of like a spectrum kind of thing. So we have one end, and then we have another end, and then we have like, we can expect that those 2 kind of extremes are well defined. So that's kind of either being, you could say, fully like, I don't know, socksed up or something, or like, I guess barefoot like D is here, and then you have everything in between. So we can write that down here in our no reply at github.com notepad right here. Horn binary trait size 3 values to more extreme stripe placement 5 main values can have things in between, and then socks 2 extreme ends plus a bunch of stuff in between. And so before we even kind of go down to the encyclopedia article, one thing that helps is if we read these two questions right here. So, I mean, C1 is just kind of more yap. You can tell what you have to do if you just go down to the answer sheet. You just have to fill in the like blocks numbers, or I guess letters, same different, whatever. But if we look at C2 here, we'll see that it's asking us to fill in the blanks to create a description of the youngest blocks in the image, and then it gives us 5 words to put in these kind of categories. So first of all, this is interesting because it tells us that it's going to give us a way to identify which blocks is the youngest in the image. But secondly, whoa, isn't that crazy? It's it's it, it's 5 values, guys. Wow, that's so cool. I'm so happy about this information. So we kind of see these 5 values, right? And we can, given that they are treated as interchangeable here, we can assume that these are our kind of stripe placement values. Now we don't know exactly kind of how they are used here, like which ones correspond to kind of which vertex of the pentagon, but we can just write them down. Kib, Wam, Zuf, Tez, and Rav are all for stripe placement. And there's also this kind of X-ish Y construction that, I mean, we can assume is used to like describe the kind of values that are in between. And we can kind of break this down more, but I think it's better if we get into that later. So now we are finally ready to read the Yapopedia. The Vlox is the most IMXO species of Zubulporth. Okay, first thing we notice, most IMXO. So IMXO probably cannot refer to whether or not the Vlox has a horn or not, because, well, you wouldn't say that something is like most of a binary trait, right? Like you wouldn't say that it's like the most horned. Like it can't be more horned, it just like has a horn. So IMXO can basically then, and we know it's not a stripe placement kind of thing, so it has to refer to size, one of the size extremes, or one of the kind of sockedness extremes. So now we can move on. Of Zubulporth, due to its playful disposition, it is a popular pet throughout Mars. Vloxes occur in 2 breeds, the polar Vlox and the valley Vlox. Polar Vloxes are usually more Melivu than valley Vloxes. Okay, so 2 things here. One, there's a footnote, but we're lazy. Well, actually, I'm lazy, so we'll get to that later. Second, more Melivu. Again, same reason that IMXO can't be a horn thing. Melivu has to either refer to one of the size things or one of the socked, whatever. Okay, we'll just call it the socks things, and if there are grammatical errors, then send me an email and I'll get back to you. Anyway, so we know, again, Melivu has to be a size thing or a socks things. Now, moving on. Regardless of breed, all Vloxes are born completely cleekly. This is an interesting one here. So, completely cleekly, again, you wouldn't say that something is completely horned. Again, it just has a horn, or it doesn't, so cleekly has to be used for size or socks. But you wouldn't say that something is completely big or completely small either, because there isn't really a limit to how small or big things can be. The word completely implies that there's an end to that, and therefore implies that cleekly is used for the socked whateverness spectrum. So that's one of the words that we're kind of using here. And the other thing is that all Vloxes are born completely cleekly, right? So once we can identify which Vlox is cleekly, and we'll get to that as soon as we're done reading through the Yapopedia, we'll be able to know which Vlox is the youngest one, like they asked in C2, because we'll just need to look for the Cleekly Vlox. Now again, moving on, as they matured, they become less and less Cleekly. Okay, like, obviously, bro, you implied that already. It is believed that all prehistoric Vloxes were Zupfish Kib or Tezish Kib. I mean, we already kind of figured that out, thankfully. But modern Vloxes display great variety and slorvitude. Okay, so I guess that weird stripe placement thing is called slorvitude. Uh, I, like, do not care. Also, that's not really relevant for the problem. In popular culture, in the Olympus Mons Explorers comics, Captain Def spaceship is called the Milovovlux. The first Martian Prime Minister, Jazurla daughter, was often seen with her Kibish Zufovlux named. In the sitcom Phobos and Deimos, the main character Phobos has three Imxovloxes, a Kibvlox named Blorblim, a Zuppish Ravvlox named and a Ravish Womvlox named Robert. and a Ravish Womvlox named Robert. The most popular song by the Bellona Quartet is "Lookin' Like a Nearly Azeltorf Lux," which spent 7 weeks at the #1 position in the Mercury Top 60 chart. That is more useful information. Nearly Azeltorf. Now, by the same kind of reason that Cleekly has to be a sockedness thing, like the word completely, nearly implies that Azeltorf is kind of like at the end of a spectrum. And so obviously, I mean, you can't almost have a horn, so this is a horned related thing. Size, I mean, like, you can't, there isn't really a limit to size in either direction, so you can't really be nearly big. And socks, well, seems like that checks out, right? Because you can be close to having, like, being on one end of the kind of sockedness spectrum, but not really, that doesn't really work for anything else, right? So we know that one kind of extreme end of the sock whatever thing is Cleekly, the other is Azeltorf. So there's that. Now I'll read the footnote. In a previous edition of this encyclopedia, we said that polar Vloxes are more Melovu than valley Vloxes. This was a typo. Obviously, it makes no sense to say more Melovu. This is, in my mind, a dead giveaway here. So we know, obviously, this isn't a strike placement related thing, but it doesn't make sense to say more Melovu, right? Now notice if Melovu had something to do with size, it would make sense to say more Melovu because size is kind of like a, I guess you can think of it as a continuous kind of value. You can be always bigger, and you can be always, well, I mean, we already have our two kind of sock related things, so it obviously can't be related to socks. But even if there could be something, you could technically be more Melovu than if it had something to do with socks. So Melovu is going to be one of our main things for describing whether a Vlox has a horn or not. So yeah, we can put that in there. The other thing is that there are some other words that we had. One of them is imxo. So imxo is probably a size thing, just process of elimination. We don't really have anywhere else it could go. And same thing actually with Melivu. So we'll put that there. These are probably our size extremes. So now that we figured that out, let's go back up and just analyze the Vloxes real quick. For some reason, it's really hard to like see them properly. Like I honestly don't really know why that's happening. It's a bit weird. That shouldn't be happening. Um, I don't know who put all this text there, or which idiot would think that like they should really make text so big as to cover the Vloxes. Like I would never do that personally. That was not the kind of thing that I would do. So now what we can do is we can look at the counts of kind of the traits here, the Vloxes with a certain trait, to kind of identify which is which. So, and we can start with kind of the whole horn thing. So we know that there are going to be, if there are two Vloxes with horns, those are A and I. So we know that there are two Vloxes with the kind of horn thing going. There's A and I. And so we're going to have, well, if Melovu means horn, then we're going to have a statement saying that there are two Melovu Vloxes. And sure enough, I know it's hard to see because of this text that, for reasons that to this day no one knows, just kind of showed up here one day. But that second statement on the left says two Melovu Vloxes. So the two Milovu Vloxes, Milovu, if there are two, obviously there are much more than two non-horde Vloxes. So Milovu has to refer to the existence of a horn, and we know what our two Milovu Vloxes are. They're the two with horns, so that's A and I. So we can write down in our GitHub notepad, or I don't even know what we're calling this anymore. I guess we'll figure that out later. We'll say that Milovu is, there is a horn. And we can go down to the bottom. And so we write down our two Vloxes with horns, A and I. So now we kind of repeat a similar process for everything else, although for the stripe placement related things, we're going to get a little bit fancier, but at least we figured this out right now. So now we'll look for the Vloxes based on size. So we look at these, we see that we have one IMXO Vlox, the bottommost statement in the middle kind of column, and two Melivu Vloxes, so that's the top leftmost statement. So looking at the Vloxes based on size, we see that we have two Vloxes that are small and one that is big. So Melivu is probably small, and IMXO has to be big. And then so our IMXO Vlox is going to be I as well. And I mean, they do allow double counting, obviously. If for whatever reason you're confused on that, what you can do is you can just count kind of the number of total Vloxes I guess they're asking for. You'll find that it adds up to more than 9, and therefore they basically have to be asking for you to double count Vloxes. If I've heard that sometimes people got a bit confused with that when they did these problems, so there's that. So anyway, our IMXO Vlox is I, and our two Melivu or small Vloxes were B and F. So we'll put that in there real quick. And now we go all the way up. So now we've identified the Vloxes based on size. Stripe placement we can deal with later because that's kind of complicated. Cleekly and Azultor. So these again have to do with socks. We know that there's going to be one Cleekly Vlox from the kind of central statement and two Azultor Vloxes from like the top middle statement. And if we look at kind of the socks related extremes, we see A and G are completely, I guess, like socksed up, but D is like, I don't know, barefoot, I guess. So again, doing the same kind of counting game we have here, Cleekly must be referring to kind of barefootedness, and so D is our Cleekly Vlox, so barefoot and Azeltorf is. How am I even going to write that? Socks. That's exactly what I meant to write. So D is our Cleekly Vlox, and A and G are going to have to be our socked up Azeltorf Vloxes. So we'll write that down here, A and G, and then our Cleekly Vlox again, D. And so now the last remaining blocks we have to figure out all have to do with stripe placement. So we just got to figure out how that works. And we can start off with a similar kind of counting game here. So we have two Kib Vloxes as seen from this, again, very mysteriously covered bottom left statement that says two Kib Vloxes. And then what else we have? We have on the kind of right column, we have three Rav Vloxes, a Kibish Zuf Vlox, and a Zufish Kib Vlox. Again, we have that ish kind of construction that we haven't really decoded yet. We'll ignore that for a second and just focus on the Kib and Rav Vloxes. So there are going to be two Vloxes that have their stripe kind of pointing to exactly one vertex, and then three that have it pointing to a different kind of vertex. And so if we just kind of look for where these guys have their kind of vertices pointing, we can see, for example, that E, F, and it's kind of hard to see, but G all have their things pointing at this kind of, oh crap, I can't draw. How unfortunate. I guess I'm going to have to make this smaller. Honestly, can't believe this. I'm so heartbroken right now. So we see that they're kind of pointed at this kind of vertex, E, F, and G, and we see, again, we have exactly three of those. So that is probably going to be our kind of Rav vertex. I'm going to need you to trust me that that says Rav. So there we actually have our Rav vertex. And so we can figure out that the three Rav Vloxes basically are going to be E, F, and G. And so we can go down and write that super quick. And now we need to look for two Vloxes that have their kind of stripe placed at a different vertex. We can look, for example, at A and H. We'll see that they have it on this kind of vertex close to where the neck of the Vlox is. No other Vlox really has their kind of stripe placed at a precise vertex, so we can be pretty sure that those are our two Kib Vloxes, and that this over here is our Kib vertex. And so for the Kib Vloxes, we're going to go down and write A and H. So now for figuring out what this ish thing means, you kind of just have to think about it. Basically, we think ish, right? Ish, basically, that suffix kind of means slightly, right? So if we have an x-ish y construction, that basically means that the thing is slightly x. And so the implication there is that although it's slightly x, it's realistically more kind of y. So x-ish y is kind of like closer to y, but leaning slightly in the direction of x is how you can kind of interpret that. And it's tough, but we're just kind of thinking about what the ish suffix represents typically in English, I believe can help here quite a bit. And so when we apply that to the case of stripe placement, if we look at kibish zuf, for example, we can expect that to mean something closer to the direction of zuf, but leaning slightly towards kib. And similarly, zufish kib is going to be something close to kiv, leaning slightly in direction of zuf. So because we know where kib is, let's just focus on that because zufish kib blocks first. So this is going to have its direction close to where the kind of kib blocks is, or not the kib blocks, but the kib, like zlor, whatever it's called thing. It's going to be close to that, but leaning slightly in a different direction. And so that basically means that our zufish kib blocks can be B or C, right? We just don't know which one zuf is, right? Now, the thing is, if there is, now we know there's a kibish zuf Vlox too, right? This is going to be a Vlox that is zuf, but leaning slightly towards kib, right? Now, the way we can figure out which one is kib here is we say, okay, which of these is leaning slightly towards kib from another direction, right? And it turns out there's actually only one that's like not on kib, that's closer to a different direction, but leaning slightly towards it. And that's I, right? So I has to be kind of our kibish zuf Vlox. And that also conveniently tells us that this kind of topmost direction is zuf, right? And so then C has to be our zufish kib Vlox. And so we can write that down here, and we're all done with part one. So they ask us to make a description of the youngest Vlox in the image. As we recall, the Vloxes are all born completely Cleekly, as this in the encyclopedia. So our Cleekly Vlox, which is D, that is our youngest Vlox in the image. And so we now need to basically figure out how this kind of stripe is being defined here. And we don't know either of the directions that this thing is kind of lodged between, but we can figure that out if we go down to the Yapopedia. And so what we see here, we have Zufish Rav. Okay, Zuf and Rav, we know where both of those are. Ravish Wam, and that's actually kind of about it. Oh, we also have Tezish Kib is an interesting one. So we have the phrases Ravish Wam and Tezish Kib. Now keep that in mind because in order for a Ravish Wam Vlox to exist, Wam obviously has to be one of the vertexes next to Rav. We know where Zuf is, and that's one of the other vertexes next to Rav. So we know that Wam therefore must be this kind of bottom left vertex because that's the only one left that can be next to Rav in order for a Ravish Wam Vlox to exist. And I mean, now you can just use process of elimination to figure out which one is Tez. It's that one. But I mean, you could also use the logic starting with Tezish Kib instead of Ravish Wam. That, okay, like Tezish Kib implies that Tez has to be next to Kib. Zuf is already one of the things next to Kib, so the other one has to be Tez, and you know where Tez is from there. And so when we look at D, we see that it's kind of close to the TES vertex, but it's leaning slightly towards the WOM vertex. And so again, the way we've defined our x-ish y construction is that the x-ish y basically means closer to y, but leaning slightly towards x. And so when we look at the stripe on blocks D, we see that it's closest to TES, leaning slightly towards WOM. So the way we're going to write that, therefore, is WOM-ish TES, right? So A, WOM, B, TES. And so now we can just go down and fill that out to close out the problem. So yeah, I hope that all made sense to you guys, and I hope you enjoyed this walkthrough of a very controversial problem, even though obviously everyone knows that blocks are the greatest thing in the world. There was no question about that. If you were, again, do be sure to send me an email if you're curious more about why blocks are the greatest thing in the world. You can email me at this email right here. I hope I made it visible enough for you guys. If you can't, again, just let me know at this email and I'll be sure to get back to you. So yeah, so I hope y'all will be sure to like and subscribe, share the series with your friends, and stay tuned for more videos. Thank you guys.